My dear friends, today I want to share with you something that has been weighing on my heart, something that Pope Francis himself has spoken about in his gentle yet powerful way, a truth that can transform not just how we eat, but how we live, how we love, and how we connect with the divine presence that surrounds us every single day. There is a phrase, just a few simple words, that many of us say without thinking before we sit down to our meals, words that seem harmless on the surface, but carry within them a spiritual poison that can slowly disconnect us from God's abundant grace and mercy. You might be surprised to learn what this phrase is, and even more surprised to understand why it matters so deeply to our souls. When we think about the act of eating, we often see it as merely a physical necessity, something we do to fuel our bodies, to satisfy our hunger, to give us energy for the day ahead. But Pope Francis has always reminded us that every aspect of our lives, even the most ordinary moments, are opportunities to encounter the sacred, to recognize God's presence, and to cultivate gratitude in our hearts. The simple act of preparing food, sitting down at a table and nourishing our bodies, is actually a profound spiritual moment, a chance to acknowledge that everything we have comes from God's loving hands. When we truly understand this, when we allow this truth to penetrate our hearts, everything changes. Our meals become prayers, our kitchens become sanctuaries, and our dining tables become altars where we commune not just with our families and friends, but with the very source of all life and love. But there is something that blocks this sacred connection, something that closes our hearts to gratitude and opens them instead to a spirit of complaint, dissatisfaction, and spiritual blindness. It is a phrase that many of us have heard countless times, perhaps even said ourselves without realizing the harm it can cause to our souls. This phrase creates a barrier between us and the divine abundance that God wants to shower upon us every day. It trains our minds to focus on what we lack rather than what we have been given. It teaches our hearts to grumble rather than to give thanks. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, it erodes our capacity for joy, for contentment, and for recognizing the countless blessings that surround us at every moment. Pope Francis has always emphasized the importance of gratitude in the Christian life. He has spoken about how gratitude is not just a nice feeling or a polite gesture, but a fundamental spiritual discipline that shapes our entire relationship with God and with one another. When we cultivate gratitude, we align ourselves with God's heart, we open ourselves to receive His love more fully, and we become conduits of that love to others. But when we allow ourselves to fall into patterns of complaint and dissatisfaction, we close our hearts to God's grace, and we become trapped in cycles of negativity that affect not just our own spiritual well-being, but the well-being of everyone around us. Now you might be wondering what this mysterious phrase could possibly be. What words could have such power to either connect us to God or separate us from His love? The answer might surprise you, because it is something that sounds so ordinary, so common, that most people would never suspect its spiritual significance. But Pope Francis, with his deep understanding of the human heart and his profound connection to the teachings of Jesus, recognizes that the smallest words we speak have the power to shape our souls in ways we can hardly imagine. Every word we utter is a seed that we plant in the garden of our hearts, and over time these seeds grow into attitudes, beliefs, and ways of being that determine the quality of our spiritual lives. The phrase that Pope Francis warns us never to say before eating is this: "I don't have anything good to eat." These 7 simple words might seem harmless, even reasonable, when we look in our refrigerator and see only leftovers or simple ingredients. But beneath the surface of these words lies a spiritual attitude that contradicts everything Jesus taught us about gratitude, contentment, and trust in God's provision. When we say these words, we are not just commenting on the contents of our pantry. We are making a statement about God's care for us, about His ability to provide for our needs, and about our own capacity to recognize and appreciate His gifts. Think for a moment about what these words really mean. When we say, "I don't have anything good to eat," we are declaring that God's provision for us is inadequate, that the food He has made available to us is not worthy of our appreciation, that we deserve something better than what we have been given. We are positioning ourselves as judges of God's generosity, as critics of His care, as people who know better than the Creator of the universe what we need and deserve. This attitude, no matter how casually expressed, creates a spiritual distance between us and God that affects every aspect of our lives. But the damage goes even deeper than this. When we habitually speak words of dissatisfaction about our food, we are training our hearts to see lack instead of abundance, to focus on what is missing rather than what is present, to approach life with an attitude of scarcity rather than gratitude. This mindset doesn't stay confined to our meals. It spreads into every area of our lives, making us less appreciative of our relationships, our work, our homes, our health, and all the countless ways that God shows His love for us. Every day, we become people who always see what's wrong rather than what's right, who always focus on what we don't have rather than what we do have, who always approach life with a sense of entitlement rather than gratitude. Pope Francis has often spoken about the poverty of ingratitude, about how it impoverishes our souls and blinds us to God's constant presence in our lives. He has reminded us that when we fail to recognize and appreciate the gifts we have been given, we become spiritually poor, regardless of our material circumstances. A person who has very little but approaches it with gratitude is richer in spirit than someone who has abundance but takes it for granted. The quality of our spiritual lives is not determined by what we have, but by how we receive what we have, by whether we approach it with thankfulness or with complaint. When we say, "I don't have anything good to eat," we are also forgetting one of the most fundamental truths of our faith, that Jesus Himself is our daily bread, that He is the one who truly nourishes our souls, and that any physical food we consume is simply a reflection of the spiritual nourishment He provides. Every meal is an opportunity to remember the Last Supper, when Jesus took ordinary bread and wine and transformed them into symbols of His infinite love for us. Every bite we take can be a reminder of His promise that He will never leave us hungry, never abandon us, never fail to provide what we truly need for our bodies and our souls. But what should we say instead? How can we approach our meals in a way that honors God and cultivates gratitude in our hearts? Pope Francis would encourage us to begin every meal, no matter how simple, with words of thanksgiving. Even if all we have is a piece of bread and a glass of water, we can say, "Thank you, God, for this food that will nourish my body and sustain my life." Even if we are eating the same simple meal for the third day in a row, we can say, "I am grateful for your provision, Lord, and I trust that you are caring for me in exactly the way I need." Even if our food seems plain or ordinary compared to what others have, we can say, "Blessed are you, God, for your generosity and your faithfulness to me." This shift in language might seem small, but its effects are profound. When we begin our meals with gratitude rather than complaint, we open our hearts to receive not just physical nourishment, but spiritual nourishment as well. We position ourselves to recognize God's love in the simple gift of food, to appreciate the hands that prepared it, to value the farmers who grew it, and to understand our connection to the vast web of life that makes our sustenance possible. We become people who see abundance where others see lack, who find joy in simplicity, who understand that contentment comes not from having more, but from appreciating what we already have. The transformation that happens when we change our words about food extends far beyond our dining tables. When we learn to speak gratefully about our meals, we begin to speak gratefully about everything else in our lives. We start to notice the beauty in ordinary moments, the kindness in small gestures, the grace in everyday experiences. We become people who build others up rather than tear them down, who encourage rather than complain, who spread joy rather than dissatisfaction wherever we go. This is the kind of spiritual transformation that Pope Francis prays for all of us, the kind of inner change that makes us more like Jesus and more capable of loving others as he loves us. But there is another reason why saying, "I don't have anything good to eat," is so spiritually dangerous, and it has to do with the way our words affect not just our own hearts, but the hearts of those around us. When we speak words of complaint and dissatisfaction, especially in front of our children, our spouses, our friends, and our communities, we are planting seeds of ingratitude in their hearts as well. We are teaching them to focus on what they lack rather than what they have, to approach life with an attitude of entitlement rather than appreciation, to see God's provision as inadequate rather than abundant. Children are especially vulnerable to this spiritual poison. When they hear their parents complaining about food, about not having anything good to eat, they learn that this is a normal and acceptable way to think and speak. They absorb the message that they deserve better than what they have been given, that God's provision is not enough, that gratitude is only appropriate when we have exactly what we want. These lessons shape their character in ways that can last a lifetime, affecting their relationships, their faith, their capacity for joy, and their ability to trust in God's care. Pope Francis has always emphasized our responsibility to be good examples for others, especially for the young people in our lives. He has reminded us that we are called to be witnesses to God's love and faithfulness, to show others through our words and actions what it means to live with gratitude and trust. When we complain about our food, we are failing in this responsibility. We are modeling ingratitude instead of thankfulness, scarcity thinking instead of abundance mindset, dissatisfaction instead of contentment. But when we choose to speak words of gratitude over our meals, no matter how simple they might be, we become living examples of what it means to trust in God's provision and to find joy in His gifts. The spiritual practice of gratitude before meals has been central to Christian tradition for thousands of years. When Jesus fed the 5,000, he first gave thanks for the loaves and fishes before he multiplied them to feed the crowd. When he celebrated the Last Supper with his disciples, he gave thanks for the bread and wine before he blessed them and shared them. When he appeared to the disciples on the road to Emmaus after his resurrection, they recognized him in the breaking of bread, in that sacred moment of thanksgiving and sharing. Throughout Scripture, we see that gratitude is not just a nice addition to our meals, but an essential element that transforms ordinary food into sacred nourishment. Pope Francis has often reflected on these biblical examples, reminding us that when we approach our food with gratitude, we are participating in a tradition that connects us to Jesus himself and to all the saints and believers who have gone before us. Every time we give thanks for our meals, we are joining our voices with the countless voices of those who have recognized God's goodness and faithfulness throughout the ages. We are declaring our trust in His provision, our appreciation for His love, and our commitment to living as people who see His hand in every aspect of our lives. But gratitude before meals is not just about looking backward to biblical traditions. It's also about looking forward to the great feast that awaits us in God's kingdom, the ultimate banquet where all of God's children will be gathered together to celebrate His love and mercy for eternity. Every meal we eat on earth is a foretaste of that heavenly feast, a reminder of the abundant life that God has prepared for us, a glimpse of the joy and satisfaction that comes from being in perfect communion with Him and with one another. When we approach our earthly meals with this eternal perspective, even the simplest food becomes precious, even the most ordinary moment becomes sacred. Now, I know that some of you might be thinking that this all sounds very idealistic, that it's easy to talk about gratitude when you have plenty of food, but much harder when you are truly struggling to put meals on the table. Pope Francis, who has spent his life ministering to the poor and the marginalized, understands this challenge better than most. He knows that there are people who genuinely do not have enough to eat, who face real food insecurity, who worry about where their next meal will come from. But even in these difficult circumstances, even when resources are genuinely scarce, he would encourage us to find something to be grateful for, some way to acknowledge God's presence and care even in the midst of hardship. The key is to distinguish between having legitimate concerns about food security and habitually speaking words of complaint and dissatisfaction. If you are genuinely hungry and have no food, that is a real problem that requires practical solutions and perhaps assistance from others. But if you have food available, even if it is simple or not exactly what you prefer, then complaining about not having anything good to eat is a spiritual issue, not a practical one. It is a matter of perspective, of choosing gratitude over complaint, of recognizing God's provision, even when it comes in forms we might not have chosen for ourselves. Pope Francis has always emphasized that true poverty is not primarily about lacking material things, but about lacking gratitude, hope, and connection to God and to others. A person who has very little but approaches it with thankfulness and trust is spiritually rich. A person who has abundance but approaches it with complaint and dissatisfaction is spiritually poor. The goal is not to pretend that we have more than we do or to ignore real needs and challenges, but to cultivate an attitude of gratitude that allows us to see God's hand in whatever circumstances we find ourselves in. There is also a practical dimension to this spiritual teaching that Pope Francis often emphasizes. When we approach our food with gratitude rather than complaint, we are more likely to waste less, to use what we have more creatively, to share more generously with others, and to make the most of whatever resources are available to us. Gratitude leads to better stewardship, to more mindful consumption, to greater appreciation for the work that goes into producing and preparing food, and to a deeper understanding of our connection to the earth and to all the people who help bring food to our tables. When we say, "I don't have anything good to eat," we are not just expressing dissatisfaction with our current options. We are also closing our minds to creative possibilities, to ways of transforming simple ingredients into nourishing meals, to opportunities to discover new flavors and combinations, to chances to develop our skills in the kitchen and to find joy in the process of preparing food. Complaint creates a mental barrier that prevents us from seeing solutions and opportunities. Gratitude opens our minds and hearts to possibilities we might never have considered. But the most important reason to avoid saying "I don't have anything good to eat" is that it contradicts the very heart of the gospel message. Jesus came to show us that God's love is abundant, that his provision is sufficient, that he can transform the ordinary into the extraordinary, that he can satisfy our deepest hungers and meet our greatest needs. When we speak words of complaint about our food, we are essentially saying that Jesus was wrong, that God's promise to care for us is not reliable, that we cannot trust in his goodness and faithfulness. We are choosing fear over faith, scarcity over abundance, doubt over trust. Pope Francis has often reminded us that faith is not just an intellectual belief, but a way of living, a way of speaking, a way of approaching every aspect of our lives with confidence in God's love and care. Our words matter because they both reflect and shape our faith. When we speak words of gratitude over our meals, we are exercising and strengthening our faith. When we speak words of complaint, we are weakening our faith and making it harder for us to trust God in other areas of our lives. The practice of saying grace before meals, of offering thanks to God for our food, is one of the most ancient and universal Christian traditions. It appears in cultures around the world, in denominations across the spectrum of Christianity, in families rich and poor, in times of abundance and in times of scarcity. This widespread practice testifies to something deep in the human heart, a recognition that food is not just fuel for our bodies, but a gift that connects us to God, to the earth, to each other, and to the source of all life and love. But saying grace is not just about the words we speak at the beginning of a meal. It is about cultivating an attitude of grace, of gratitude, of recognition that everything we have comes from God's loving hands. This attitude should permeate not just our meal times, but our entire lives. It should affect how we think about our work, our relationships, our health, our homes, our challenges, and our opportunities. When we learn to see God's hand in our daily bread, we begin to see His hand everywhere, and our lives are transformed from the inside out. Pope Francis has often spoken about the importance of small gestures, of simple acts of love and faith that might seem insignificant but have the power to change hearts and lives. Choosing to speak words of gratitude over our meals instead of words of complaint is exactly this kind of small but powerful gesture. It costs us nothing except the willingness to shift our perspective, but it can have profound effects on our spiritual lives, our relationships, our mental health, and our capacity for joy and contentment. When we make this simple change, when we commit to speaking thankfully about our food regardless of what we have, we often discover that our actual eating experience improves as well. Food tastes better when we approach it with gratitude. Meals are more satisfying when we recognize them as gifts. Even simple fare becomes more enjoyable when we receive it with appreciation rather than disappointment. This is not just a psychological trick, but a spiritual reality. When we align our hearts with God's heart, when we choose gratitude over complaint, we open ourselves to receive not just physical nourishment, but spiritual blessing as well. The transformation that happens when we change our words about food often extends to other areas of our lives as well. People who learn to speak gratefully about their meals often find themselves speaking more gratefully about their work, their homes, their relationships, and their circumstances in general. They become people who notice and appreciate small blessings, who find joy in ordinary moments, who build others up rather than tear them down, who create atmospheres of positivity and thankfulness wherever they go. This is the kind of person Pope Francis calls us to be. Not perfect people who never face challenges or difficulties, but grateful people who choose to see God's hand in every circumstance, who trust in His provision even when it doesn't match our preferences, who speak words of blessing rather than curse, who cultivate hearts of thanksgiving rather than complaint. These are the people who change the world, not through grand gestures or dramatic actions, but through the simple daily choice to align their words and attitudes with the heart of God. But what about when we are genuinely disappointed with our food options? What about when we have been looking forward to a particular meal and it doesn't turn out as we hoped? What about when we are tired of eating the same thing repeatedly? Pope Francis would not ask us to pretend that we don't have preferences or that we don't sometimes feel disappointed. He would ask us to acknowledge these feelings honestly, but then to move beyond them to a place of gratitude and trust. We can say, "I was hoping for something different today, but I thank you, God, for providing this food that will nourish my body." We can say, "This is not my favorite meal, but I am grateful that I have something to eat when so many people in the world are hungry." We can say, "I am tired of this particular food, but I recognize that having food to be tired of is itself a blessing that many people do not have." The key is to acknowledge our human feelings while choosing to focus on God's goodness and provision rather than on our disappointment or dissatisfaction. This approach to our food challenges reflects a broader spiritual principle that Pope Francis often teaches, the importance of finding God in all things, even in circumstances that are not what we would have chosen for ourselves. Life is not always going to give us exactly what we want when we want it. Food is not always going to be exactly what we prefer. But God's love and care for us remain constant regardless of our circumstances, and we can choose to recognize and appreciate His presence even when things don't go according to our plans. The phrase, "I don't have anything good to eat," also reveals something deeper about our relationship with the material world and our understanding of what constitutes good food. In our culture, we are often taught to value food based on its expense, its rarity, its sophistication, or its ability to impress others. We are encouraged to think that good food must be fancy food, exotic food, restaurant food, or food that requires expensive ingredients and complex preparation. But Pope Francis, who has chosen to live simply and to identify with the poor and marginalized, would challenge us to reconsider these assumptions. From a spiritual perspective, good food is any food that nourishes our bodies and is received with gratitude. A simple meal of bread and soup, shared with love and thanksgiving, is better than an elaborate feast consumed with complaint and dissatisfaction. A piece of fruit, eaten with appreciation for the farmer who grew it, the earth that produced it, and the God who created it, is more valuable than a gourmet meal taken for granted. The goodness of food is not inherent in its ingredients or preparation, but in the spirit with which it is received and consumed. This understanding liberates us from the tyranny of constantly seeking more elaborate, more expensive, more impressive food options. It allows us to find satisfaction and joy in simple meals, to appreciate the basic staples that sustain life, to recognize the beauty in ordinary ingredients prepared with care and consumed with gratitude. It connects us to the vast majority of people throughout history who have found nourishment and satisfaction in simple fare, and it aligns us with Jesus Himself, who fed multitudes with basic bread and fish, and who chose to make ordinary bread and wine the symbols of His ultimate gift of love. Pope Francis has often spoken about the danger of consumerism, of the way our culture teaches us to find our identity and worth in what we own, what we buy, what we consume. This consumerist mentality affects every aspect of our lives, including our relationship with food. We are taught to be constantly dissatisfied with what we have, constantly seeking the next upgrade, the next experience, the next thing that will finally make us happy and fulfilled. But this pursuit is ultimately futile because it is based on the false belief that external things can satisfy the deepest hungers of our hearts. When we say, "I don't have anything good to eat," we are often expressing this consumerist dissatisfaction, this feeling that what we have is not enough, that we deserve something better, that our current options are inadequate. But the truth is that our deepest hungers cannot be satisfied by any food, no matter how good it might be. Our souls hunger for God, for love, for meaning, for connection, for purpose. These hungers can only be satisfied by spiritual nourishment, by relationship with God and with others, by living according to God's purposes for our lives. Recognizing this truth allows us to approach our physical meals with proper perspective. Food is important because our bodies need nourishment, but food is not the ultimate source of satisfaction or fulfillment. When we receive whatever food we have with gratitude, when we see it as a gift from God rather than a consumer product, to be evaluated and criticized, we free ourselves from the endless cycle of dissatisfaction that characterizes so much of modern life. We learn to find contentment in simplicity, joy in ordinary pleasures, satisfaction in God's provision rather than in our own ability to acquire what we want. This shift in perspective has profound implications for how we live in the world. When we are content with simple food, We are less likely to overspend on groceries, less likely to waste food, less likely to be driven by advertising and marketing that tries to convince us we need more expensive or elaborate options. We become better stewards of our resources, more mindful consumers, more grateful recipients of God's gifts. We also become better examples to others, especially to children, of what it means to live with contentment and gratitude rather than constant desire for more. But the benefits of avoiding the phrase, "I don't have anything good to eat," extend beyond our individual spiritual lives and our personal relationships with food. When we choose gratitude over complaint, we also contribute to creating a more positive and grateful culture in our families, our communities, and our world. Complaint is contagious. When one person starts complaining about food, others often join in, and soon the entire atmosphere becomes negative and dissatisfied. But gratitude is also contagious. When one person chooses to speak thankfully about their food, it often inspires others to recognize and appreciate their own blessings as well. Pope Francis has always emphasized our responsibility to be instruments of God's peace and love in the world. This calling extends to the smallest details of our daily lives, including how we speak about our food. When we choose to speak gratefully, we are helping to create an atmosphere of thanksgiving and contentment that can transform our homes, our workplaces, our communities, and our world. We are participating in God's work of healing and restoration, one grateful word at a time. The practice of gratitude before meals also connects us to the global community of believers and to the broader human family. When we give thanks for our food, we are reminded that not everyone has enough to eat, that food insecurity affects millions of people around the world, that access to nourishing food is not equally distributed. This awareness should move us not just to private gratitude, but to public action, to supporting efforts to feed the hungry, to address the root causes of poverty and inequality, to work for a world where everyone has access to the nourishment they need. Pope Francis has consistently challenged us to see the connection between our personal spiritual practices and our social responsibilities. Our gratitude for our own food should inspire us to care about those who lack food. Our appreciation for God's provision in our lives should motivate us to be instruments of that provision for others. Our recognition of food as a gift from God should lead us to share that gift generously with those in need. When we avoid saying, "I don't have anything good to eat," and choose instead to speak words of gratitude and appreciation, we are not just changing our words, we are changing our hearts, our perspectives, our relationships, and our contribution to the world. We are aligning ourselves more closely with God's heart, opening ourselves more fully to His love and grace, and positioning ourselves to be more effective instruments of His peace and compassion in the world. This transformation doesn't happen overnight. Like all spiritual growth, it requires practice, patience, and persistence. There will be times when we forget, when we fall back into old patterns of complaint and dissatisfaction. But each time, we catch ourselves and choose gratitude instead. We strengthen our spiritual muscles. We deepen our capacity for joy and contentment. We become more like the people God created us to be. Pope Francis would encourage us to be gentle with ourselves in this process, to remember that spiritual growth is a journey rather than a destination, to celebrate small victories and to learn from our mistakes. The goal is not perfection, but progress. The aim is not to never feel disappointed or dissatisfied, but to choose gratitude and trust even when we do feel those things. Each time we speak words of thanksgiving over our food instead of words of complaint, we are taking a step forward on the path of spiritual maturity and closer to the heart of God. The phrase, "I don't have anything good to eat," might seem like such a small thing, such an insignificant detail in the grand scheme of our spiritual lives. But Pope Francis, with his deep understanding of human nature and his profound connection to the teachings of Jesus, recognizes that it is often the small things that make the biggest difference. It is in the ordinary moments of our daily lives that our character is formed, our faith is strengthened or weakened, our capacity for love is developed or diminished. The words we speak over our meals, the attitudes we cultivate toward God's provision, the gratitude or complaint we express in the simple act of eating, these things shape our souls in ways that can last a lifetime and beyond. As we come to the end of this reflection, I want to invite you to make a commitment, not just to avoid saying, "I don't have anything good to eat," but to actively cultivate gratitude in your relationship with food and with all of God's gifts in your life. Start tomorrow morning, or even today if you haven't eaten yet. Before you take your first bite, pause for a moment and give thanks. Thank God for the food, for the hands that prepared it, for the farmers who grew it, for your ability to taste and enjoy it, for the way it will nourish your body and sustain your life. If you are eating with others, invite them to join you in this practice of gratitude. Don't preach your lecture, but simply model what it looks like to receive food with thanksgiving rather than complaint. If you hear others complaining about their food options, gently redirect the conversation toward appreciation and gratitude. Help create an atmosphere where God's provision is recognized and celebrated rather than criticized and dismissed. Remember that this practice is not about pretending that all food is equally delicious or that we don't have preferences and disappointments. It is about choosing to focus on God's goodness and faithfulness rather than on our dissatisfaction and desires. It is about training our hearts to see abundance where others see scarcity, to find joy in simplicity, to recognize the sacred in the ordinary. It is about becoming people who build others up rather than tear them down, who spread gratitude rather than complaint, who reflect God's love and generosity in every aspect of our lives. The spiritual journey is made up of countless small choices, countless opportunities to align ourselves with God's heart or to turn away from His love. The words we speak over our meals represent one of these opportunities. Every time we sit down to eat, we have a chance to choose gratitude over complaint, trust over anxiety, recognition of God's provision over dissatisfaction with our circumstances. These choices, repeated day after day, meal after meal, gradually transform us into the people God created us to be, grateful, content, trusting, loving people who recognize His hand in every aspect of our lives. Pope Francis has shown us through his own life what it looks like to live with this kind of gratitude and simplicity. He has chosen to live modestly, to appreciate simple pleasures, to find joy in ordinary moments, to focus on what really matters rather than on accumulating more possessions or seeking more elaborate experiences. His example challenges us to examine our own attitudes toward food, toward material possessions, toward God's provision in our lives. Are we people who are easily satisfied and quick to give thanks, or are we people who are constantly dissatisfied and quick to complain? The answer to this question affects not just our own spiritual well-being, but our relationships with others and our effectiveness as witnesses to God's love in the world. People are drawn to those who radiate gratitude and contentment. They are inspired by those who find joy in simple things, who appreciate ordinary blessings, who speak words of thanksgiving rather than complaint. When we choose to receive our food with gratitude, we become more attractive witnesses to the transforming power of God's love in our lives. But beyond being attractive witnesses, we become effective instruments of God's peace and healing in a world that is often characterized by dissatisfaction, complaint, and constant striving for more. In a culture that teaches us to be constantly dissatisfied with what we have, constantly seeking the next upgrade or improvement, constantly comparing ourselves to others and finding ourselves lacking, the simple practice of giving thanks for. Our food becomes a radical act of faith and resistance. When we say grace over a simple meal, when we express gratitude for basic nourishment, when we choose appreciation over criticism, we are declaring that God's provision is sufficient, that His love is enough, that contentment is possible even in a world that profits from our dissatisfaction. We are modeling a different way of living, a different set of values, a different relationship with the material world and with the God who created and sustains it. This is the kind of witness the world desperately needs to see. Not perfect people who never face challenges or disappointments, but grateful people who choose to trust in God's goodness even when circumstances are difficult. Not people who have everything they want, but people who appreciate what they have been given. Not people who never feel disappointed, but people who choose gratitude and faith even when they do feel disappointed. As you leave this reflection and return to your daily life, I encourage you to carry this message with you. Remember that every meal is an opportunity to practice gratitude. Every time you open your refrigerator or pantry is a chance to recognize God's provision. Every moment you spend preparing or consuming food is a moment when you can choose to align your heart with God's heart. Don't underestimate the power of this simple change. Don't dismiss it as insignificant or trivial. The words we speak shape our hearts shape our actions, and our actions shape our world. When we choose to speak words of gratitude over our food instead of words of complaint, we are participating in God's work of transformation, both in our own lives and in the lives of those around us. If this message has spoken to your heart, if you recognize the truth in what Pope Francis teaches about gratitude and contentment, if you feel called to make this change in your own life, then I encourage you to share this message with others who might need to hear it. Share it with your family members, your friends, your co-workers, your social media followers. Help spread this simple but powerful truth about the importance of gratitude in our daily lives. Subscribe to receive more messages like this one, messages that challenge us to live more faithfully, more gratefully, more lovingly in every aspect of our lives. Let's commit together to becoming people who recognize God's hand in every blessing, who speak words of thanksgiving rather than complaint, who find joy in simplicity and contentment in God's provision. Let's choose to be instruments of His peace and love in a world that desperately needs to see what gratitude looks like in action. Amen.